In Stormblood... Oh! This feels familiar. Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind, and this time we're just playing ranged physicals, and we got a large majority of 8-man content. Speaking of which, for Duty 1 we went to Ramuh Hard as Dancer, and Nox and Ilana are here. Considering how frequently we get Ramuh Extreme, there isn't really that much to talk about in regards to the fight, although the big major difference between Hard and Extreme here is that when you don't get help, instead of dying outright, you're just not allowed to play for 45 seconds, or until someone helps you after all. Actually, speaking of which, the Shock Strike Tank Buster also breaks the fear effect, so since it isn't a direct one-shot on Hard, could a tank save a lost DPS by getting them hit with it? Thoughts? Either way, it is sort of a classic that mechanics like this aren't done properly on Hard, since the fight is still winnable even when this goes wrong, so many players simply don't learn how this works until they go into Extreme and have to, and some still don't learn by that point. For Duty 2, we went to Ignore the Flames as Machinist. It is worth mentioning, despite the nerfs, that Machinist's AoE at this level is still quite effective, so remembering that all of the enemies must die to clear the guild test, it may make a lot more sense to simply spam Spread Shot and let your other DPS focus the boss. For Duty 3, we went to O10N, Omega's Midgardsormr, which means we're at level 70 as Machinist. A very strange observation we had somewhat recently in the community Discord, link in the description, was about the fact that Hotshot's damage is quite low with this level. And it turns out, when you do the math, that the combined heat and battery gauge generated by the 1-2-3 combo added on top of the average potency offset combo is slightly more potency per GCD invested than Hotshot offers. We're talking like less than 10 potency difference. But essentially, it means in a vacuum, and in the context of an infinitely long encounter, Hotshot is actually a damage loss to use in this level range. In the context of raid buffs though, having more battery gauge to use Rook Autoturret more frequently during raid buffs might make it worth it again. But it is still very peculiar that Hotshot is so weak now that by the time your 1-2-3 combo is all upgraded to their heated equivalents, Hotshot isn't entirely worth using exactly on cooldown without context. We of course clear the fight nice and easy. For Duty 4, we went to Under the Prediction as Bard, and Venomous Bite was just about worth using. For Duty 5, we went to Titan Hard. An interesting observation that came up in this run is that I decided to send all of my cooldowns right at the get-go, which of course meant I only got like 10 seconds of value out of them as Titan left. However, it took almost exactly 2 minutes from that opening until the final phase, which meant that I got to do a proper opener burst anyway despite that. A little Bard-specific tip here is also that on Hard, the jail applies a nasty 75% damage down to whoever it targets, and Warden's Paean can remove it. For Duty 6, we went to Bismarck Hard as Dancer, just barely too low level for close position. And the Samurai and the other Dancer knows me. Hello! A Dancer-specific tip for this fight is to remember that you can do Standard Step preemptively to get the cooldown running, to get more standard finishes over the course of the fight. Another tip for this specific fight is, specifically for the purple weather, players are targeted by lightning, which are effectively spread markers. If you stack too close, some players could die, so spread out. That's it really. For Duty 7, we went to Castrum Meridianum as Machinist. Our Black Mage was doing some rather weird things with their rotation, which led to a bit of a discussion about why Black Mages, and sometimes Ninjas, get called out so frequently for very specific rotational mistakes, while many other jobs just don't. Well, for Black Mage, it is extremely obvious if the Black Mage is slow casting a Blizzard 3, or spamming Fire 3, or repeatedly casting Fire 2, or whatever else you can come up with, since the exact spell being cast is shown on their cast bar. Imagine if when playing a melee DPS, in the same area where the cast bar for other players are shown in the party frames, it just showed what action you just used until you use your next one or until the GZD has fully passed. It would suddenly be a lot more obvious if someone is making a rather obvious mistake. Then, at the same time, for some jobs, you need a bit more context to know whether it is a mistake. For instance, a Pictomancer just spamming their RGB combo can be correct for even an extended period of time. If everything is painted and on cooldown, then they might not have any other option. So you would need to be actively watching the Pictomancer to know for sure whether what they're doing is actually a mistake. This can be expanded to a lot of jobs, but in essence, the reason why specific roles and jobs gets called out for mistakes frequently is simply because the mistakes they make are very obvious for anyone to call out. Oh, a dot on only one target? Well, everyone knows that's wrong. Ooh, a black mage spamming ice magic? Well, everyone knows that's wrong. A healer spamming cure 1, a tank not using AoE on AoE packs? You know the drill. I've mentioned this before, but an interesting exercise to make is to try, in a duty like this, to pay attention to what the DPS are doing by looking at them. That ninja that isn't using dots on single target might just be making some other mistake. That other DPS that doesn't appear to make any obvious problems might be doing their 1-2-3s in reverse. Anyway, in conclusion, this dungeon went just fine. It's just a funny thought experiment. For Duty 8, we were an instant replacement bard in World of Darkness. Always the Alliance raids. And the duty went pretty mundanely, so how about we talk about a couple of mechanics. On the 5-headed dragon, every so often, it summons Dragonfire fly adds that tether to players. Every few seconds, the mob attacks the currently tethered player, which builds a separation debuff. Anyone can survive maybe 1 or 2 stacks, perhaps even all of the stacks if they're healed in between hits every time. But generally, the best approach is to pass the tether to someone else once you have 1 or 2 stacks. Simple as that. For the Atomos fight, a little trick is that if you get targeted by the suck-in, simply willingly jumping off the platform prevents the Atomos from sucking you in, which also prevents it from doing the directed cone knockback that follows after. And, well, you're getting shoved off the arena either way, so willingly jumping will finish the mechanic faster. Finally, I know this one is probably kind of obvious, but I wanted to highlight that on Cerberus, while the saying goes that A takes the adds, the chains group C only really requires 2 players, so you could help with the adds too. While it can be scary to tank one of the adds as a DPS, if you only have to tank it for a little bit, it isn't that bad, so the more players focus on the adds, the easier it gets to handle. For Duty 9, we are a 9-minute replacement for Ultima Weapon Extreme as Dancer, and just like last time we were a replacement here, we enter to immediately get sucker punched. Now, as I have sort of gone over before, both in this series, in my shorts guide for this specific fight, and the full 2 minutes AR Extremes guide, aside from the tank switching, the only mechanic that really matters in this fight is soaking the orbs. Pretty much everything else you can just sort of wing it and you'll be fine. For the first set of orbs, the machinist and I shove over to 1 orb together while the tanks take another, immediately solving it. For the second set, I take the inner orb with a healer while one of the tanks takes both of the other orbs. For the third and final set, I take 2 orbs with a healer and others, while the same tank rushes around to get whatever else is needed. One thing is for certain, as I've said before, the one thing that truly matters in this fight, aside from not dying to the avoidable damage, is to get at least 1 orb out of every pair, and then simply kill the boss. For Duty 10, we went to A12N, Alexander, as Machinist. A very solid run too. A mechanic that can be a bit confusing is the time stop itself. 1 player gets a stack marker, and a few players get like turquoise spread markers? What makes it sometimes confusing is that for a normal raid, a lot of surprising stuff happens all at once. The screen starts to warp a bit as the stack and the unusual looking spread markers all appear at once, which sometimes causes first timers to focus on the stack marker, but assuming such a player has a spread marker on them, that will cause everyone in the stack to possibly die. Simply put, and probably quite obviously, the spreads go away while everyone else stacks. Another thing that can be surprising about this fight is that the boss actually hits reasonably hard and regularly chunks the current tank with tank busters that strike in a cone, so if the tank isn't positioned right, other players can get sniped by it. We managed to get through it reasonably well though. For duty 11, we went to our friend the Turtle as Bard, and indeed, not much happened. An odd piece of advice I would give here is that while putting a dot on the turtle might seem like a terrible idea since you don't want to kill it, using Venomous Bite will help you do the most damage in the shortest time possible, necessary to get the turtle to 50% faster. At the same time, the dot is weak enough that there is no chance that it will kill the turtle past that point, even if the whole dot ticked out. I mean, if you somehow found yourself in a group that ends up killing the turtle, you monsters, then the dot would simply not be the main culprit of that. For duty 12, we went to the Gobu dance, and well, here I actually think Venomous Bite isn't worth using, even on the Gobu, since it needs to sit for like 12 seconds to be even considered worth it, and despite me deliberately shooting other things first, my dot only lasted 10 seconds. For duty 13, we went to the snowy mountain of Void Sense, and it seems our tank might have been a first timer, but you cannot blame them for at least attempting to pick up the ads that spawned. The fight was also just about long enough to justify the reapplication of both dots. Barely. For duty 14, we went to Thornmarch Hard, and just like last time we were here, I believe as a ninja, sending the 2-minute burst right out the gate is rewarded by the fact the king appears nearly 2 minutes into the fight, just long enough that you can start your attack and then lead into the burst. That said, there wasn't really anything that stood out in the fight itself, as we easily are victorious. For duty 15, we went to the first trial of Endwalker, which is like giga spoilers, so if you don't want to see it, jump to this timestamp here. Now, that said, we of course went to Zodiac Normal as Machinist, and both the Scholar and Pixelmancer knew me. Hello! Now, this boss has 3 standout things that tend to catch players, so let's talk about those. The first one is Astral Flow, that bit where he uses his ability to bend existence to, turn the arena 90 degrees. Of course, he bends only the arena's angle, not the player's. When he is spinning behemoths, it is usually pretty easy, as when both behemoths are on the same side, one quadrant of the arena will be safe both before and after the spin. When they are across from each other, simply standing in the AoE of one of the behemoths mean you will end up in a safe place. When he does Astral Flow with the snakes, it gets a little bit harder to see. However, if all else fails, getting really close to the center of the arena can make it a lot easier to see where the safe spots will be. Simply put, you kinda do have to look at which way the arena is spinning, as while it can already be mildly challenging to see what the safe spot would be, the 2 ways the snakes can spin will cover exactly the opposite parts of the arena. So blindly guessing would lead to a 50% chance of being hit. The second mechanic that catches some players is Astral Eclipse. The first tip is that the tell is really far out in the distance. That should really be all you need, I think. Although another little bonus tip is that Zodiac becomes attackable during the mechanic. The final thing I wanted to mention is that a classic thing with Zodiac is that a DPS uses Limit Break and promptly half the raid dies. It is somewhat random, but it almost never fails, so using Limit Break 3 for damage almost seems like a cursed decision in this specific fight. The one that tends to get players is the huge line AoE that shoves players off, followed by the Styx stack marker. And there, you would really prefer to have the Limit Break either to rest players or to tank albeit. Fortunately, we didn't even use Limit Break here. And finally for duty 16, we went to Leviathan Extreme, again, as Bard, and nearly half the raid leaves immediately. Fantastic. Well, we did get replacements. We had at least both Fern and Agent Monica. On the first attempt, we mostly got overwhelmed by players getting shoved off the arena, which then made the healing too hard. For the second attempt, a lot of players got killed by the middle dashes and slides, such that, despite us beating the final wave tooth in time, we didn't have enough power remaining to overcome the boss before wiping. For the third attempt then, we finally have a high elemental converter for the first big raid wide. When we get to the extra dashes and slides in the second phase, one of our tanks drop off the arena. Thankfully, we also survive through this and make it to the last phase, where one of our Reapers dies a Dreadstorm being planted right on top of the crucially important wave tooth. However, with 7 players alive, this is still an easy win. Well done, team. Quite a few more interesting duties this time around. I'm not entirely sure if I find the extremes where we beat them first try, or the ones where it takes a few pulls more interesting. I guess the best middle ground of excitement are those where we barely push through and win by a hair. And we have now also passed 11/19ths of the way on the achievement. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, certain physical jobs could apply resistance down effects that would increase the damage of specific damage types between slashing, piercing, and blunt. Both Machinist and Bard dealt piercing damage, however, only Dragoon, who also dealt piercing damage, was able to apply the piercing resistance down debuff, effectively making ranged physical jobs reliant on Dragoon being present in a party to be able to do their best.